I can share my screen if you can you hear me?
We can hear you well, and we can also see a presentation.
Which presentation? I see the discussion of the previous paper. I can probably try to share my screen.
Yes, you can share the screen.
Okay.
Please.
Let me see if I can. For some reason, it doesn't let me share. You see my screen or not?
We currently see you only.
For some reason, it doesn't let me share. It's deactivated the.
We're gonna share for you.
We try to share it in this room. So let's 1 minute.
Okay. Probably it's a little bit easier if I share, but is there a way to activate the? Okay.
You should be seeing now. So this is your presentation, correct?
Yes, perfect. Okay.
Please start.
Okay. Many thanks to the organizers for including our paper in this conference. This is a great agenda. We're very happy to be contributing here today. A little bit of an introduction. My name is Anton Skotidis. I'm an economist at the board. This is joint work with Stacey Schreff. Stacey is the Deputy Director of Research in the OFR at the Treasury. And moving the next slide, please. Given that we're both affiliated the federal government, usual disclaimer applies. Next slide, please. So let me start with the fact. The fact is that the global financial system goes through an unprecedented digital transformation, and a new threat to financial stability has emerged: cyber attacks. Everyone is worried. Policymakers are concerned that a cyber attack can trigger financial crisis. Academics are worried. Darrell Duffy and Josh Younger from JP Morgan a couple of years ago wrote a very nice paper where they emphasize cyber attacks as a financial stability risk. And at the same time, industry participants are worried because, as they consistently cite, cyber risk as a top risk in surveys, such as the Bank of England Systemic Risk Survey. However, next slide, please. Although we know for a fact that the financial system, let alone the US financial system, is a prime target for cyber attacks, the truth of the matter is that it has yet to experience cyber attack with systemic consequences. And one reason for that we frequently hear in Congress and we frequently read in policy outlets is the considerable preparation and contingency planning for cyber attack, the government and financial institutions. And I take this directly from a congressional hearing back in 2015. Financial institutions frequently rehearse response to cyber attack scenarios and highlight their contingency planning to provide continuity in the sector in the wake of a cyber attack. Next slide, please. The problem here is that this is all good stuff. If you're an empirical researcher, you quickly realize that it's very difficult to gauge the importance of contingency plans in practice. And this is because you need to study an actual event, potentially with financial stability implications, in order exactly to assess the importance of these contingency plans. The problem here is that most known to us events are just hours-long events with no implications for financial stability. The second thing is that you need to be able to identify who is impacted by the cyber attack, who is not impacted by the cyber attack. If you're familiar with the terminology used at the Fed, this is confidential supervisory information. Well, on top of being confidential supervisory information, this is also very sensitive data, which makes it very challenging to use for research purposes. Finally, you need access to high-frequency data not only within but also across days to capture the effect not only of the common shock but also potential contagion to the rest of the system. So next slide, please. What we bring on the table is a study of a unique event that incorporates all these three features. A multi-day cyber attack on a major technology service provider that serves thousands of financial institutions, both in the United States and globally. I will not be able to tell you which TSP was impacted. I will not be able to tell you when the attack happened and how long it lasted for. And this is because some confidentiality constraints were put on the paper not to release it publicly. What I will tell you, though, is that given its size and scale of operations, that was potentially a financial stability event. So what happened? Next slide, please. As soon as the TSP discovered evidence of an attack on its computer network, it disconnected affected servers from the internet. As a result, the banks that were relying on this TSP in order to connect to Fedwire and send payments over Fedwire, they were immediately impacted because they lost the reliance on the TSP. At the same time, other banks, either because they had their own pipelines to connect and send payments over Fedwire, or because they were using alternative TSPs, they had nothing to do with the cyber attack, with TSP's efforts to recover from the cyber attack, and as a result, they were not impacted. Here it is important to say that GSIBs, the US GSIBs, the US mega banks that were not users of this TSP, and when we exclude them from this analysis, we find that users were relatively larger than non-users. So this is important. Why am I stressing this? Because the banks that were users of the TSP, they were not just some banks, obscure banks somewhere in the financial system. They were actually larger than non-users if we exclude GSIBs. So what we do in this paper, we study the financial stability effects of this attack, but also contagion through the payment system. Why the payment system? Because it's a common yet crucial transmission channel for stress in the financial system, as we know from previous literature. Next slide, please. So now, armed with a treatment group, armed with a control group, but also the raw Fedwire data, one can just go ahead and plot the payments activity by users and non-users before, during, and after the cyber attack. So what you see here on the left is the number of payments, on the right, the value of payments. On the x-axis, we have days, because the raw Fedwire data is daily data. Well, you don't really see days. All you see is t equals 0, which is essentially the first day of the attack. And you may have noticed that on the y-axis, both lines start from 1, okay? And these interventions to the raw data is because we want to protect the sensitivity/confidentiality of the event. Despite those interventions, though, well, there are a couple of key takeaways from these graphs. The first one is that there's greatest disruption on the first day of the attack, which is depicted by the first red vertical dashed line. And consistent with the idea that the TSP gradually restored services on subsequent days, we see some gradual improvement both in terms of the number and the value of payments. Importantly, we find similar trends in payments activity of users and non-users, both before but also after the cyber attack. Why is this important? Because it gives us confidence that what we observe in these graphs can in principle be attributed to the cyber attack itself and not something else that is happening at the same time. Now, we broke things down by users and non-users. In principle, we can pull everything together and try to understand, try to assess the magnitude of the disruption in the aggregate. So moving to the next slide, please. There was no disruption in the aggregate. And as a matter of fact, if I go ahead and remove those red lines from the graphs, probably you guys have no idea there was a cyber attack here. So moving to the next slide, the questions we are ultimately interested in this paper is, first of all, how is this possible for such a major technology service provider, systemic technology service provider, be affected by a cyber attack with no financial stability consequences? Did banks adapt to the shock? And if so, how? Did the Fed take steps to mitigate the impact of this cyber attack? And if so, what kind of steps? And the reason we're focusing on these questions is because these are ultimately the questions our policymakers are interested in. We need to know exactly what works and what doesn't in practice. So moving to the next slide. Before I start digging deeper what we do in this paper, I think it is important for us to discuss and have in mind a conceptual framework of our empirical exercise. If you want, in other words, an illustration of how cyber attack can affect the financial system through the payment system. So what I show you here is a typical Fedwire trading day. Okay, so starting from the left with Bank 1, we see that Bank 1 sends $100 payments to Banks 2 and 3. As soon as Banks 2 and 3 receive $100 payments from Bank 1, they go ahead and send $100 payments to Bank 4. And Bank 4 on the far right, as soon as it receives $200 payments combined from Banks 2 and 3, it goes ahead and sends $200 payments back to Bank 1, and this completes the picture. However, the devil here is in the details. The question is, what exactly do we mean when we say Bank 3 sends $100 payments to Bank 4? Now, practically speaking, it means that staff in Bank 3 are sitting in front of a software which is provided by the TSP. They log in with their credentials and the passwords, and they're able to connect to Fedline Direct and make their payment. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that the TSP just disconnected affected servers from the internet in order to contain the cyber attack. As a result, the software that staff in Bank 3 are sitting in front of is not going to work anymore. So moving to the next slide, this is not a problem at all for Bank 2. Why? Because it's not a user of this TSP. So for Bank 2, during the cyber attack, this is business as usual. They're able to proceed payment of Bank 1 to Bank 4. For Bank 3, however, its preferred option, which is what I described earlier with the software, is not there anymore. So, and this brings me to the contingency plans. the question is, what other alternatives Bank 3 has in order to make a payment to Bank 4? Concretely, there are only two alternatives for Bank 3 to make a payment to Bank 4. First of all, to upload an Excel file with information to send payments. Now, practically speaking, this means that there is another software that automatically generates Excel files, which then staff in Bank 3 need to send to staff in Fedwire. Okay, the problem here, where's the friction? The friction is that this is a different software unrelated to the TSP. Okay, so in order to connect to this software, you need to know credentials, you need to know passwords. And if you don't know your credentials and passwords because you have never used this option before, because your preferred option is option 1, but it's not available anymore, the question is, can you have easy access to those credentials and passwords? The second alternative is literally staff in Bank 3 pick up the phone and call staff in Fedwire. Okay, now, apart from the fact that only 3 transactions are allowed per phone call, the friction here is that when, for instance, Bank 3 calls the wholesale product office at the New York Fed, they're not calling their friends. This is a confidential call. This is a secured call, which means that you need to know your credentials. You need to know your passwords. If you've never used this option before, the question is, can you have easy access to those credentials and those passwords? Okay, so this is what we mean in this context by contingency plans. Okay, next slide, please. We also need to keep in mind that in such contingency situations, the Fed recommends banks to prioritize transactions to those that the institution has identified as the most critical, particularly later in the business day. Okay, so if we assume for now that Bank 3 cannot make the payment, $100 payment to Bank 4, focusing on Bank 4 only receives $100 payments from Bank 2, plus 50 that has as reserves in its master account at the Fed, it has access to $150 to make a payment of $200 back to Bank 1. So you see how the initial cyber event can turn essentially into a liquidity event for the rest of the financial system, unless Bank 4 finds an alternative source of funding, which in this case, since reserves are not enough, you can either go to the interbank market or you can tap the discount window for funding. So next slide, please. For this presentation, but also in the paper, when we refer to the first round effect, essentially we keep an eye towards the direct effect, which means that we will be comparing the differential payments behavior of Bank 2 and 3. When we will refer to the second round effect, we will keep an eye towards contagion, which means practically that we'll be studying the incoming payments of Bank 4. And when we refer to the third round effect, we keep an eye towards broader contagion financial stability, which means that we will be studying the outgoing payments of Bank 4. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the direct effect, the first round effect. Next slide, please. And in the interest of time, I will just go quickly through the empirical model. I think what is important here for us to remember is that the raw Fedwire data is transaction level data. We go ahead and aggregate at the Bank 1, Bank 2 day level. Why are we doing that? Because we are interested in two dependent variables, which is, first of all, the number of payments, but also the value of payments for each pair of banks on each day. And we work on a first differences model because we know that there is high seasonality in payments in Fedwire. These dependent variables, we regress on two dummies. The first one is the dummy users, if you are a user of the TSP. And then 3-day dummies, the first day of the attack, the first day of the attack, the last day of the attack, the last day of the attack. And then we have a dummy for the middle period of the attack. This can be 1 to 3 days. We cannot really reveal the length of the middle period of the event. And again, this is in the spirit of protecting confidentiality of the event. So next slide, please. So
1 minute to conclude. You have 1 minute.
Okay. So ultimately, what we're interested in is 6 coefficients. 3 for the number of payments and 3 for the value of payments. What we find here is that users send fewer payments over Fedwire. Of course, this is not the economic effect. This is just the estimated coefficients. In order to find the economic significance of the event, on the first day, we're going to focus on the first day of the event when disruption was most severe. We have to ask the question, what share of all Fedwire payments was lost due to the cyber attack? So we're going to use the estimated coefficients, some back of the envelope calculations, and what we find is that 0.5% of payments was lost on the first day of the event. Why the effect is so small? You will tell me that GSIBs are not impacted, but ultimately what we're interested in is whether banks switch to alternative methods in sending payments. The problem here, the curse of being an empirical researcher, is that observing how banks switch to alternative methods is not available to us. So moving to the next slide, please. We're going to run a counterfactual. The counterfactual is going to be, we're going to assume 0 users sending 0 payments throughout the event, particularly on the first day of the event. And why are we going to run this counterfactual? Because it's going to give us the upper bound estimate of what would have happened had banks not switched at all. Okay, so the blue bars that you see over there, essentially the same blue bars that you saw earlier, these are the estimated coefficients of the counterfactual. This is not the true economic effect. We're gonna do the back of the envelope calculations. What we find is that 9.4% of the value of payments would have been lost had banks not switched at all. So now the question is this a big effect? Well, we need to have a benchmark. And the only benchmark, if you want major disruption that we have in the past in Fedwire, was the 9/11 effect. We did the math. It turns out to be that this effect, had banks not switched at all to contingency planning, was 1/3 of the 9/11 effect. And remember that no GSIBs, the mega banks, were impacted by this attack. I'm not sure I have time to continue. However, I would like to continue a little bit with the next slide, which is just to conclude the first round effect at least. So in this slide, we're asking the question, given switching, conditional on switching, did banks prioritize larger payments and use extended Fedwire hours? So let me tell you quickly what you see in this graph. So on the left, we have the half-hour distribution of the number of payments that users sent on the first day of the attack, which is red line, along with the half-hour distribution of the number of payments on the left and the value of payments on the right, the same day in previous and following weeks, okay? So moving to the next slide, what we see ultimately in order to answer this question is we're not interested in the number of payments, we're not interested in the value of payments, we're interested in the value per payment. So we have to read both graphs together. What we see here is that the average payment users sent in the afternoon was 86% larger compared to the morning. Moving to the next slide, please. We also find that they send larger payments during the extension of the trading day that the Fed granted. And importantly, moving to the next slide, please, we don't find such intraday trends before or after the cyber attack. Now, taken together, and this concludes the direct effect, all this evidence suggests that banks switching to alternative ways in sending payments is very important as a mitigant during a cyber attack. I gather that I don't have time to go through the contagion. Is that right?
Yes, the time is over. So I would maybe open the floor for discussion, and then we can continue debate just afterwards. So, Mr. Francesco Velasquez, please, floor is yours.
Okay. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss this paper that is on a very timely issue. So I will try to be quick to try to cover also those points that the presenter didn't have enough time to, so maybe it can be informative for the overall discussion. So essentially, as documented by the presenter, essentially we are in the presence of a major cyber attack to this technology service provider that is used by a large number of financial institutions. The paper is constructed around three effects, as has been mentioned. And the one presented before is the first round effect. So essentially the impact on the sender user of the TSP platform. Then there is a second round effect on the receiver non-user, and then a broader third round effect, as discussed, as briefly mentioned by the presenter. So the conclusion is related to the importance of contingency plans to limit the impact of cyber attack, and as documented by the presenter, essentially we have a kind of counterfactual exercise now in the revised draft that show the meaningful impact of the cyber attack in the absence of contingent plans. So the paper is a very interesting one is also benefit from in the confidential data. So essentially there is pretty much no competition there because the authors are the only one that will have the capacity to run the experiment. So it is therefore something unique also in the small literature in terms of cyber attack. I think I understand and I get completely the point that there are reasons of confidentiality, so my comment will be related to whether there is a possibility to provide a little bit more details to the reader on some aspect that deserve a little bit more discussion, especially because the topic is indeed very technical. Additionally, probably there is a scope to link a little bit more the paper with the theory. There is a JFE paper looking at the impact of cyber attack on the payment industry, so this could be something that is closely related to the empirical exercise. Additionally, there is some possibility to formally test difference in the different day of the event. So I organized the discussion across the three effects. So the first question is related to the first round effect and the control group. So what I didn't completely understand, and it could be my problem, I have to admit, is whether the composition of the control group include also those banks that are using the second round effect. So the non-user are defined as non-user at all, or they include also the non-user that are receiver from the sender of the TSP. I think I don't have a clear answer on whether they should be there or not, but at least there should be some discussion on the choice made by the author and try to defend the choice. The other question that I have is about the estimation window, because the only thing I can get from the paper is essentially there are more than 50 days of estimation windows because of the standard error cluster on the but there is not much indication on the time window used. My understanding is, for instance, the post period is longer than the event period, but I may be wrong. The other question is a sender-receiver pair level analysis. I wonder if this is fully consistent with what you show in the terms of figure. So this is was not quite clear. So is the figure related to sender-receiver pair level or is aggregate level? If it's aggregate level, is it meaningful to run a regression where the dependent variable is the total amount of payment or number of payments made by the senders? And then in terms of specification, you experiment different type of fixed effect. I wonder why not to use per fixed effect, because you show that there are different potential treatment of different receiver by the bank, by the sender bank. The question here for the second round effect, how exposed are the exposed bank? So this will help to give a little bit more economic flavor on the test. So to briefly summarize the test, essentially they look at non-user receiver that are exposed to the sender and whether this non-user receiver receive less funding. So the exposure measure is the critical bit. So is it big? Is it not big? How big it is? And if it's not big enough, can you run some tests on extremely exposed banks? So do we have some kind of heterogeneity in the effect? And we show that essentially the impact is very large if you have a large inflow, expected inflow of payment. This is something I already mentioned, but and this is also related to the last part of the paper. You mentioned different action taken by the bank later on. So small banks, large banks, they react differently. So the question is, what drives the different reaction is, for instance, different exposure. So how much is related the different response to a different exposure? A final question is, can you run an experiment where the control group in this second round effect is non-receivers that are not related to the TSP? So you have two groups of, so we have receiver from the TSP and non-receiver, non-related to the TSP. So if they can be compared rather than looking only at the intensity, this could be feasible or not, I'm not sure, to be honest. Finally, the third round effect, again, the indication here is there is not much effect there. I will go back to my previous point. It may be important to look at whether there is some sort of effect if you have a large exposure, a very large exposure. this could indicate, for instance, that there is some sort of different policy implication, because the contingent plan can be useful, but if you are extremely large exposed, even the contingent plan cannot be entirely sufficient. Overall, a great paper, very nice written, very nicely written. A little bit more details on the empirical specification could help the reader with a not broad knowledge of the setting to navigate across the different effects. Thank you.
Thank you. We now allow the author to respond some of the questions, and then open floor for questions both online and in the room. Please.
Francesco, many thanks. Many thanks. Very good comments. Dave, for taking the time to read the paper. I kept some notes. If I missed anything, please let me know. First of all, some more information about the event. We have to be careful here. We have to respect the confidentiality constraints. But I agree with you that it would have been helpful. So we have to see what we can do on that, staying within the boundaries of the confidentiality of the event. The second, link to the theory. Yes, we're working, as I emailed you, we're working on a revision, and we're gonna link it to the theory. That's a very good comment. So the time period, we will probably have it in the new version. It's essentially 3 months. Okay, so the event happened somewhere in between, and we have 3 months of data. And this is where we say in the paper that we have more than 50 days that goes back to the clustering. On the you made a comment about the why do we need the receiver dimension in the data set. First of all, let me say that we run the regressions also with a sender, just a sender. We aggregate everything at the sender. The effect, of course, goes through because we see it in the graph. Why do we need the receiver dimension? Well, this is, as you rightly point out, and in the new version of the paper, we'll actually include it. We will include sender-receiver fixed effects. And the reason is that we want to control for the average, because, it's a different thing if you have 2 large banks sending payments to each other, so the volume is going to be different in terms of levels compared to 2 small banks. So this is going to be captured by the sender-receiver fixed effects, and we will have it in the new version of the tables. Exposure, the average exposure of receiver bank is around 15%. As far as I remember, it's around 15%. So it's not very small. And there is, I don't remember on top of my head the standard deviation, but it's 15%. So you have guys that were affected. Of course, you have also banks that were less affected, but you have banks that are heavily exposed to the shock. Which brings me to your last point. I think it is worth investigating a little bit more what happens with those banks that are extremely exposed. Probably we can try to do related to their responses, whether you go to the discount window or to the interbank market. But I think it is worth investigating how their outgoing payments, sort of the broader financial stability dimension that I said earlier, is changing for these banks. Let me know if I missed anything, and I'm happy to take more questions.
No, perfect. From me, it's everything.
Yes, we have questions from the room. Can we have a mic?
Oh, hi. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Hi, this is Eric Vincent from Banque de France. So I was just thinking about your graph. So if I understood correctly, on average, they are making only 1 transaction per day. So if I understood that correctly, what are the implications in terms of, because what I understand is that if you only have a limited number of transactions, you can actually replicate it and do them manually. But what would be the implication if you had other events targeting services where you have so many transactions that you cannot replicate them manually?
Okay, I'm not sure which graph you're referring to. Many payments are allowed, not just one. So if you have in mind the graph of the half-hour distribution of the payments, if you see the levels, it's not one. It's multiple transactions are allowed per day. So you're right that multiple transactions are allowed. So these guys have to prioritize consistent, and this is actually what we find, consistent with what the Fed recommends, they have to prioritize the larger payments. So if I have to make 100 payments, because this is usually what I do, and the system is down, and I use some contingency planning, either like it's going to be either like by phone or like send manually to the Fed, we find that they prioritize the largest ones.
Does this answer the question?
Yeah, so you don't have the slide, but I'm sure. So there was one slide where you could see like the average, and there was only one. So I'm not sure what was the scale. Maybe it was in logarithm. So yeah, but you cannot show the slide. So it's all right.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I can help here, I think the figure, as far as I remember, is normalized. So you are right, it's a scale.
It's a normalized figure. Okay,
yeah.
So I understand now. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any other questions? Then I will use the opportunity and then present one myself once more. So you're mentioning in the paper that obviously the contingency plans, they are important for financial institutions, which is clear. I'm wondering whether there is any evidence on the robustness of those contingency plans based on your research or your personal view, either comparing the size of the banks or its geographical locations or maybe even frequency of the incidents. So what you would see or recommend in terms of the robustness of those contingency plans? Thank you.
So it's a good question. We haven't explored, like, we haven't dug deeper into like the robustness of these contingency plans. I think my personal view is that something that actually goes back to Francesco's paper earlier, that, you know, large banks probably have the capacity to enforce, to implement those contingency plans, either because they hire, like, you know, better IT security staff, or because they have generally the capacity to do them faster and better. So I think probably this is, you know, the size of the bank or like IT spending and stuff like that. I think that would be a good proxy for, you know, the usage of contingency plans if these things are not observable in the first place. Now, in terms of geography, I think there is a huge data limitation. If I understand the question is like, maybe these guys have, you know, contingency locations in order to connect. You know, banks do have these. We don't. I think it's a data limitation in order to exploit this, to exploit further. But I think it's a good question, though.